Hey guys, Heidi Preeb here. So the video that I'm making today is kind of a follow-up video to the best and worst jobs for ENFPs video that I made a couple weeks back. I listed the #1 job as writer, and I am definitely a little bit biased there because I have been doing writing on and off, but for the most part that has been my main occupation in life. So I've had 5 books and probably upwards of 1,000 articles published. I've also ghostwritten hundreds of scripts, social media posts, speeches, and in a few cases parts of books for thought leaders and entrepreneurs. And I also run a writing Instagram account, which is currently pretty inactive, but for a while I was posting there every day. So this is all just to establish kind of where I'm coming from when I talk about all of this stuff, because I wanted to give some tools for how I manage writing as an ENFP and some of the tips that I've learned along the way. So I have definitely learned predominantly through trial and error. I don't have any formal education in writing. Sometimes that shows when my work gets into the hands of an editor. I'm like way too happy with the M-dashes in absolutely everything I write. But I do think that every type approaches creative expression through a slightly different lens, and obviously no two ENFPs are going to be exactly the same in their writing style. No two ENFPs are going to approach the craft in the same way, but I'm going to share a little bit about what has just worked for me personally, and if it helps you out, and if there's anything in here that feels useful for you, then that's awesome. Some of this is just general advice, and other parts of it we're going to talk about your cognitive functions. And if you don't know what I mean when I say cognitive functions, I'm talking about extroverted intuition, introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, and introverted sensing. We all use 8 cognitive functions, but prefer 4 of them. And the 4 that the ENFPs prefer, I go over in depth in my ENFP Soul Bootcamp course, which is a 6-week self-study program that you can check out on my website at www.heidipreeb.com. We tell kind of the story of the ENFP's psyche as if it's the movie Inside Out. So all of those different areas of processing are personified and played out as characters who talk about what it's like to be an ENFP and how to navigate the world more authentically as the type you are, rather than trying to fit yourself into someone else's mold. So when it comes to writing as an ENFP, I've narrowed it down to 5 tips that I would give myself if I were starting out all of those years ago, in order to save myself some time and start accepting that the way I work is not the way everybody else works, and that's okay, and something really brilliant can come out of that, right? I think that a lot of ENFPs think like I have to be this very disciplined, very eloquent, very detail-oriented writer, or else I'm not a true writer, right? But, and we will get deep into this when we get into these points, I think that the things that set you apart are actually the things that are going to make you the most relatable, the most effective at communicating your ideas, the most interesting to your audience. So a lot of this piece is just going to be about not abandoning yourself in your writing, right? Because the voice that you have is the voice that you should be communicating. Don't try to erase who you are in your work in order to please some standard that doesn't come naturally to you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm going to start with tip #1 for the ENFP writer, which is start in the middle, start with the meat and potatoes, and then build the side dishes around it. So I've talked about this in past videos, but one of the best pieces of advice I ever got as an ENFP is when I was writing the ENFP survival guide in, I think it was like 2016, I sent out a survey asking ENFPs for the best pieces of advice that they would want to give to other ENFPs. And someone wrote back saying, when you have a big challenge or a big task, start in the middle. Start with the part that you're really excited about, invested in, and then build the structure of everything else around that thing. Don't try to start at the beginning and then work logically in a sequential fashion until the end. That will just make you lose energy. Start with the part that you're already fired up about, and then let everything else fall into place around that. And that is the single best piece of advice in terms of creative work that I think any ENFP could get. And I cannot take credit for it. It was not my idea. I don't even have the real name, I don't think, of the person who sent that in. But I absolutely structure my own writing in that capacity all of the time. So I start with whatever idea is really interesting to me, whatever question is kind of gnawing at my psyche that I really want to answer or to explore through writing, and I write that down. I write down the paragraph that made me want to sit down and write in the first place, right? And then I look at that paragraph or that chapter or whatever it is and go, okay, what is missing here? So if a person who knew nothing about this topic or who only knew a little bit about this topic were arriving at this paragraph, what would they need explained to them in order for them to understand it? And often that helps you build out the beginning parts of the piece of writing as well as the end parts. So again, you're kind of building out from a singular idea. I kind of picture it as like putting the structure of a house up before you nail the walls in, right? If you try to build the walls without the structure in place, it's not going to make any sense. And I think that for ENFPs, that's what it feels like to us when we try to start a piece of creative work at the natural beginning and then work our way to the end. It's like we're constructing walls without a frame in place. So for you, what I want you to do is build the frame of the most important room first. Get that idea fleshed out, figure out what it is that you're really trying to communicate, and then let the rest of the structure fall into place around it. The last thing that you should be adding is the walls and the details, right? The last thing that you should be adding to your writing is the stuff that you find kind of boring, because by the time you get to the end, you'll just get excited that you're that much closer to completing the project, and then it won't feel as grueling to add in the things that felt a little bit dull at the beginning because you see the overall project and you're so close to the end. So for me, what this looks like in practical terms is usually I will sit down and kind of write out the parts I'm most excited about, and then I will take that and extrapolate a structure for the overall piece of writing from it. So if it's an article, usually I will figure out, okay, how do I bring the reader to this paragraph in a way that makes sense and that's engaging? And how do I end it in a way that kind of wraps things up nicely? If it's a book, what I'll often do is sit down and write the titles of every chapter, and then I'll go through and write the subtitles of every chapter within the chapter, because it's about figuring out what you want to communicate. If you can figure out what needs to be communicated and the structure for communicating that idea in a logical, sequential way, it's going to make the rest of it incredibly easy, because your brain is not running all over the place trying to figure out what do I include, what do I not include? And then it's just about filling in the blanks, right? So sometimes I will break down, let's say, a chapter into word count. So I'll go, okay, I'm writing a chapter on, let's say, Myers-Briggs. This actually is a real example. I'm currently working on a book that required me to have a chapter about Myers-Briggs, just kind of giving an overview of the system. So I was like, okay, I know I want this chapter to be about 6,000 words. So I want to have a brief explanation of each type. So I wrote down each type: ISTJ, ESTJ, ISTP, ESTP, etc., etc. And then I went, okay, I know that to get the person there, they first have to understand what the dichotomies mean. So I wrote I versus E, N versus S, T versus F, P versus J. And then I went, okay, I also know I want to give people a more nuanced understanding of the cognitive functions. So I wrote down SI, SE, FI, FE, all the cognitive functions, right? And now I can go through and dedicate how many words I want to approximately write about each of these topics. So if I spend 2,000 words explaining the cognitive functions, then I have less words to give to, let's say, the dichotomies, and that's okay. I can figure out the budget, right? Actually, that's exactly what it is, budgeting words. And because there's 16 types, I'm probably gonna have to keep the descriptions relatively short, because that word count is gonna add up quickly. So maybe I can only give 200 words per type. And what that means is that I have to find a formula for being really concise in my type explanations. So what I'll do usually is take one of the explanations and try to write out a model for it. So go, okay, what is the first sentence going to be? What is the second sentence going to be? What is the third sentence going to be in terms of theme and what it's communicating? And then I'll replicate that for each of the types. And this is actually a formula that I learned in high school. When I was learning how to write an essay, they said one of the most useful things you can do is before you write the essay, write the structure about the essay. So what that means is instead of writing your opening line, write, this opening line is going to communicate what my thesis is in a provocative yet clear way. This line is going to be an example showing what I mean. This line is going to be research that backs that up. This line is going to be about drawing it all together in a meaningful way and explaining what comes next. That isn't necessarily how you should actually do an opening paragraph of an essay. I was riffing a little bit there. But that idea of planning what you're going to write and what the structure of what you're going to write is before you sit down to write it can be incredibly helpful if you need to write something that's very structured. So tip number one is the number one thing that I focus on when I sit down to write something new. Figure out the most important thing that needs to be communicated and then build a clear structure around it. And obviously you can give yourself leniency and flexibility as you get into the actual writing in each of those cases, but from the get-go, it just kind of calms our minds down a little bit, and we'll talk about this again later in the video, when we know where we're supposed to be going, as opposed to just sitting down and writing and going, okay, I'll just see what happens along the way, right? That's going to take us down a lot of rabbit holes, which can be useful sometimes, but if you're trying to write something specific, that's not the best strategy. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit in this video. Okay, tip number 2 for the ENFP writer, but this is really the advice I would give to absolutely anyone who's interested in getting into writing. Have something to say. This sounds like it should be obvious, but I really think it's not. I think a lot of people think of writing as kind of a craft, and it is. There is definitely, absolutely a craft to writing, the way that there is a craft to any form of artwork. But my personal diehard belief about writing is that your writing is as interesting as the idea that you're communicating. If you have something really hard-hitting, powerful, something that's capable of changing the way people look at something to say, if you can clearly communicate what that idea is, you are a good writer. But that's also not as simple as it sounds, right? Like, you can have a good idea, but if you communicate it in a very dry way, or a way that kind of doesn't make people feel something about it, you haven't communicated it clearly enough. Because if it really is a good idea and you communicate it well, people will feel something about it, right? Now I'm doing the any thing in my brain where I'm like arguing with myself, where I'm like, what about boring scientific papers where they communicate things clearly, but they're still really boring? I don't know, jury's out on that. But if you're trying to write an academic paper, this is not the video for you. This is the video for you if you're trying to write something that has a little bit more of your personality in it. But anyway, bringing it back to my personal philosophy, which is anytime I am stuck, anytime I am facing writer's block, anytime I'm feeling creatively challenged, I ask myself, what is the truest thing that I can say about this topic? Just write that down. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be eloquent. Just write down the truest thing you know how to say about the thing that you're trying to communicate. And then write the next truest thing. And then figure out what pieces of information are missing in order for people to understand those things you just said, and keep building from there. Often when I'm stuck with a piece of writing, I'm not stuck because I can't think creatively. I'm stuck because I can't think truthfully. So maybe I'm trying to make a point that as I'm making it, I'm realizing, oh, I'm kind of deluding myself here. Or I actually don't know as much about this as I thought I did. And it takes a lot of humility to be able to recognize that, right? Sometimes in the middle of a piece of writing, I have to put it down and be like, oh, I actually don't know enough to write this yet. So I have to go learn more. I have to understand in a more deep way. I have to integrate what I've experienced as well as what I've cognitively compiled through researching this topic. And I have to find a way to bring those together. But if it's feeling difficult, it's probably because I don't have that kind of core truth about it yet that I'm ready to share. And that is a difficult place to be in. I think that especially in today's day and age, when we are constantly trying to pump out content and create as much as we can, there is not a lot of people really talking about the value of slowing down and only creating when you actually have something really meaningful to share. But I am a die-hard believer, truly die-hard believer, that you cannot be a good creative person if you do not know how to stop when you don't have a truth to share. Does that make sense? Like, if you are creating despite the fact that you know you don't know enough about the thing you're trying to share, you're being a dishonest creator. And dishonest creativity is great for some things, selling cars and commercials, but it's not great for producing really profound, impactful, life-altering pieces of writing. So this kind of has turned into a different point that I was not intending to make, but I think that a really important part of writing is knowing when not to write, right? Like, there was multiple years of my own life, not too recently, where I could not write anything at all. Like, truly nothing. I could not write an article. I could not write an Instagram post. I just did not have something in me that was kind of fully cooked enough to actually deliver to the world. And it is actually the best thing you can do, I believe, during those periods, if you're able to just stop writing. Stop creating, give your brain room to breathe, process what you're learning, process what you're going through, allow yourself to have creative dry spells. I promise you it will make you a better creative in the end. So my kind of bar lately is, if I would not absolutely yell this to try to get through to someone, then it probably doesn't necessarily need to be written and communicated. And that's not to say that every line that you write in any piece of writing is going to be something that you want to shout from the rooftops, but the core of your piece of writing should be something that you really want to get out into the world, that you think is completely vital that the world knows, and that you would love for everyone to understand. If your writing does not have that at the heart of it, it will not be good writing. It just won't. Because there is going to be no heart in it, there's going to be no spirit to it, and the audience is going to be able to feel that. The reader is not going to be able to connect with something if you are not connected to it as the writer. So do yourself the service of, yes, practice your craft. I think there is lots to be said for writing when you're not super inspired to get in the habit of writing, but Don't beat yourself up, is what I'm saying. If you can't produce brilliant pieces of writing on command or consistently, right? That's actually a very normal part of the creative process. A really good piece of work to check out if you haven't already read it is Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. I think I talked about it in another video. I put off reading this book for many years because I didn't really love Eat, Pray, Love, so I wasn't sure I liked Elizabeth Gilbert. And then I started following her on Instagram and was like, oh my God, I love Elizabeth Gilbert. Like everything she says here speaks to me. So I bought Big Magic, and it's such a good book on living a creative life and how to kind of manage your energy around your creative output and how to make sure that you are living enough to actually have things to say. And I firmly believe Elizabeth Gilbert is an ENFP. The way that she talks about the world is just so ENFI to me. So this all kind of ropes back to that Henry David Thoreau quote, how vain it is to sit down and write when you have not stood up to live, right? That is my guiding philosophy with writing, guiding philosophy with creative work in general. Unless you are contracted to write every single day because that's your job, which to be fair, it has been for me at some point, so I understand that struggle. I really believe that your writing should always be significantly less than the experiences that you're having around that writing, if that makes sense. Like your writing should come from a place of having a new, deep, profound way of looking at life in the world that you are dying to express and communicate. That is where good writing comes from. So if you feel like there is no good writing left in you, that's fine. Maybe you've just said all you have to say for now, right? Maybe you need 5 more years of experience before you have something to write about again. Go out into the world, get that experience, and wait until you are bursting to share it. That is when your really good work is going to come, right? I'm not saying that you always have to do work from that space, but if we're talking about the kind of life-altering, show-stopping pieces of work that have come out of ENFPs in the world, I truly believe that's where it comes from having lived in a giant, humongous, completely unconventional way, and then sitting down to share that. All right, tip number 3, and we are going to ground ourselves a little bit here. I'm gonna step down off my soapbox, is just about how to structure the time that you give yourself to write. So I firmly believe that for ENFPs, we're going to do our best work when we have a little bit less time than we need. Now, this is not a new principle. This is not a principle I invented, and it's also not a principle that is considered exclusive to ENFPs. I think that most perceivers kind of operate this way, right? When we are given the time to go run and explore and play with ideas endlessly, we will truly do that endlessly. For example, right now I have an essay due in a week and a half, and for a month and a half, I've been thinking about this essay and kind of passively reading things that are related to the essay I'm going to want to write, but I keep getting distracted and going down rabbit holes and just kind of playing my way around this theory because I have time to, right? So I haven't gotten anything concrete written yet because the time pressure is not on yet. Now, here's why time pressure works for us. I think that a lot of Ps kind of think it's like a magic trick, like suddenly when you don't have enough time, now you can do it. It's not magic. It's just how our brains are naturally wired, right? We prefer to be in information gathering mode. Being a perceiver means that you prefer the stage of any project where you are just passively taking in new information, gathering and gathering and gathering new thoughts, and placing them all into the kind of greater scheme of what you know. We will do that for as much time as we have to do that because it's our natural tendency and the way that we naturally like to operate. So I'm going to give you an example by likening our extroverted intuition, which is our dominant cognitive function as ENFPs, with SE, which is the dominant cognitive function of ESFPs and ESTPs. So if you take an ESTP and you tell them, go play around in the forest all day, and you unleash them in this national park, they are going to go exploring, they're going to kind of figure out the lay of the land, and they're probably going to go down a whole bunch of different paths and explore a whole bunch of different areas based on what looks interesting to them in the moment, right? That is what dominant extroverted perceiving functions like to do, is just get the lay of the land and figure out what they're dealing with, and it's really fun to explore. Extroverted intuition, so our dominant cognitive functions as ENFPs, is the same way in the world of ideas and theories and constructs. So if I am writing an essay and I tell my brain it's time to go play in the world of ideas, go read some stuff related to this topic, and just go explore. My brain is going to go down a million different routes. It's going to get lost sometimes. It's going to find its way back. It's going to get the lay of the land intellectually. Now, it's important to note that you are sending your brain in with a very specific goal when you're doing that, right? And that goal is important. Getting the lay of the land matters. But if you change the goal, you change the outcome. So let's say we take that ESTP, right, and tell them, your goal is not to just explore this park, it's to summit this one particular mountain. You have 5 hours to do it. Now, you know they're not going down different side routes, they're not exploring widely, they're just looking at the summit, figuring out what is the route I need to take to get there, and they're following that route to accomplish the goal. The same thing happens for us intellectually as any dominant types. When we set a specific goal within a specific time frame, our brain naturally goes, here's where I have to get to. What route is going to take me there? And it naturally starts mapping out the way that we have to go in order to arrive at the summit, which is that piece of writing, right? So it looks at, okay, I need to make this point very clearly. Which studies do I need? Okay, where do I find those studies? Okay, what information am I missing? Where can I get that? It forces our brain into a kind of structure that if we are left to our own devices, we won't naturally force ourselves into because our brain likes to play around and just get the lay of the land. And both parts of that process are incredibly important. I think that to live a creative life as an extroverted, intuitive, dominant type, you have to be constantly letting your mind, when it's just in your spare time, float around and read different books and try on different theories and explore different ways of living. That is you getting the lay of the land. So that when you are ready to sit down and produce a piece of creative work and you have a time crunch, to already have that kind of mental layout set up for when you sit down to do the creative work. So this is all to say, having a time crunch basically forces your extroverted thinking online. It forces you to figure out, how do I get from here to there? And you will naturally start seeing what you don't know yet and now need to find out. Your brain will not naturally go in that direction until you have a reason for it to. So try to give yourself deadlines that give you a little bit less time than you think you need. That is how you're going to shine. So sometimes I set false deadlines for myself, or sometimes I kind of force myself into doing a deadline by like making myself accountable to the person who I know I have to hand it into and telling them I'm gonna get it done on this day, so that I force myself to kind of feel that time pressure before it's incredibly important that I actually hand it in. And that doesn't mean that you should disrespect the false deadline. Respect the false deadline. It's a means of getting you to do the stuff you want to do in an actual timely fashion, as opposed to allowing your brain to continue to endlessly gather information, which is what it is naturally inclined to do as an ENFP. Okay, tip number 4 is also a little bit more on the practical side of things, and this is be very cautious as an ENFP about your tendency to over-explain theory and underproduce concrete examples. So I think that a lot of ENFPs, myself included, often go into things thinking, I will just explain the kind of higher level concept multiple different times in multiple different ways, and people will catch on to it. And we don't realize that even us as intuitives actually need concrete examples in order to extrapolate those principles from when we're consuming information. So if I lost you there, let me give you an example. If I read a theory about how the Enneagram works, right? So I read kind of the context of the Enneagram and people talking about how it disconnects you from your essence, and there are all these different types, and these are the kind of spiritual problems they're up against, I am going to get this kind of archetype in my brain. But it's not going to be as powerful as it would be if you explained that archetype and then gave me 3 different examples of what a type 9 looks like. 3 different examples of what a type 2 looks like in different situations. My brain is now naturally going to start connecting the dots between those examples and going, okay, so these 3 Enneagram 2s, let's say, have these things in common, but not these things in common, which means I can extrapolate that the thing that is consistent between those 3 Enneagram 2s is getting me closer to the essence of what it means to be an Enneagram 2. That is how our brain likes to come to solutions as an Enne dominant type, but we forget that we have to give that same practicality back to people when we are explaining these higher level principles that we've extrapolated from examples in our own life. So we naturally watch the world, figure out which patterns we see within different things that are happening in real life, in our actual experience of being alive, and we will extrapolate the theory from there. Now, to explain it back to people, we have to give them the same ability to extrapolate and to ground what we're saying in reality. So, as an ENFP, our tendency can be to just be so proud of our theories and so proud of what we've come up with that we just want to explain the theory, but we have to be very conscious of that. So my kind of rule of thumb is give the theory, give 2 or 3 examples depending on what piece of writing you're doing and how many examples feel appropriate and interesting. And then if it makes sense to, connect it back to the theory. But I think that a lot of the time we're trying to do too much work almost, when what we need to do is present the facts and let our readers come to their own conclusions about the theory. And we will be obviously leading them in this process to the theory that we're trying to explain. But a really good writer doesn't tell the audience what to think or feel. A really good writer leads the audience to the natural conclusion that they're trying to convey. It lets the reader feel like they got there themselves. Does that make sense? So allow the reader to go through the process you went through in figuring this thing out. Show them different examples, let them form the pattern on their own, and then when they get to the end of your piece of writing where you explain the pattern a little bit more overtly, they're going to feel so proud of themselves for having gotten there already. So to do this really well, what you want to do is think about who your reader is and try to give some examples that they could relate to. So writing about personality theory is going to cater to a different audience than, say, writing about space exploration. You have to think about who you're writing for and what kind of examples they would need in order to connect with the material. And it's very helpful that you are highly aware probably of MBTI and the different personality types people have. And so you can cater your approach specifically to different types based on which types you think might be consuming your reading. Now, this does not mean lose your authenticity or lose your voice. We're going to get to that in the last point. But what it means is that the very fact that you're aware of type theory means you have a heightened ability to perspective shift. You have the ability to step into other people's shoes and kind of think to yourself, what would this person need to understand about what I'm saying that maybe I take for granted that I already understand because of the way my cognitive processes work? And how can I include that in a way that feels accessible to people who think very differently than me? And if you want to take this one step further, you can also look at which biases your audience might have, which is kind of what type is, right? It's really an examination of which biases and blind spots we're holding, but you can bake that into your writing. You can kind of lead someone naturally from a problem they're having, so grounding it in the concrete, into a blind spot they have. You can explain the theory that helps them to see and understand that blind spot, and then back into the practical world of, okay, what do we do about that? And a lot of the time in, let's say, psychology writing, that's a very useful skill. Being able to help people connect how their real world experiences are translating into / connecting to specific theories, and then how they can show up in the real world in a different way with this new understanding of theoretical knowledge. So do not discount the fact that the knowledge base you have about type gives you the ability to consciously and intentionally structure your writing in such a way that you can cover many different types of blind spots depending upon who your reader is. And that leads me to tip number 5. Now that I have told you all about how to cater to people who are unlike you, I want to remind you not to lose your voice in the process of writing, right? So I think that what is so special about ENFPs is that we really do perceive the world in kind of a different way than a lot of people. Our type is not that common. And that has humongous drawbacks, but it also has really humongous benefits when it comes to creativity, because we are able to get deeply in touch with that introverted feeling in a way that a lot of people are not capable of doing. Consider the fact that having introverted feeling as your second cognitive function means that you are actually kind of in the best position to observe it. So people who have introverted feeling as their first cognitive function, INFPs and ISFPs, most of the time they are absolutely brilliant creatives, but what they are doing is kind of purely expressing the emotion. Whereas when it is your second cognitive function, as it is for ENFPs and ESFPs, you're able to observe your emotional experience from a bit of a distance and analyze it, and that is a very unique skill. That's one that not a lot of people have and not a lot of people capitalize on, which means we have this kind of unique vantage point that we can share with the world. And that is very useful to people. So I see a lot of ENFPs thinking that because maybe the type of sharing that they want to do, the type of creating that feels authentic to them, is not the way that they see other people creating, they have to change their creative style in order to suit the world. But what you are actually doing is taking away from yourself the thing that would make you unique as a creative, and that is your competitive advantage. So I see sometimes ENFPs wanting to train themselves to kind of have this almost unnaturally eloquent and kind of measured creative voice, when what is brilliant about ENFPs and what we can uniquely bring to so many creative endeavors is the fact that we are so gritty, right? Like, we are both grounded in reality and creative and passionate and inventive. And when you juxtapose those two things, you get a really kind of funny, engaging, down-to-earth way of explaining complex topics. Do not train that out of yourself. Do not do it. I promise you, if you are an ENFP, if you lead with extroverted intuition and follow it up with introverted feeling, that specific ability to juxtapose what's real with what's theoretical in a way that is funny and engaging and lighthearted in one moment and then profoundly emotionally jarring in the next, you will be absolutely fulfilling your creative destiny because that is what you naturally shine at. If it feels like you are struggling so much to fit a certain creative mold, consider throwing out that creative mold. Truly consider throwing it out. For example, I will write, produce, film almost nothing that I do not have complete and total 100% creative autonomy over. Why? Because when I'm limited by the confines of what a company or a website or whatever it is needs me to stay within, I cannot express the thing that I need to express to the world in the exact way that I'm capable of expressing it. And so I will be cheapening my work. And it's okay sometimes to cheapen your work if what you want is to just make money and you're not particularly concerned with sharing your vision. But if your goal as a creative is to share what you believe to be true about the world, consider how you can find as much creative autonomy over your projects as humanly possible. And that might mean giving up money, opportunities, whatever it is. You have to decide how much your integrity matters to you versus how much opportunity matters to you. And I'm not saying that you will never have to compromise in those areas. You will. And you will just have to be aware of which compromises you're making and how you can keep yourself grounded throughout those compromises. But I truly think, from the bottom of my heart, the biggest mistake you can make as an ENFP writer is to lose your voice by trying to sound like someone who is more palatable. Right? I feel like I can think off the top of my head of various ENFP writers who've gotten slammed continuously for swearing, for being almost too real, too raw in their writing. But why are we hearing about those criticisms? Because those people first got famous, because they were so unabashed in the way that they shared their voice. The ones who are out there trying to adapt themselves to what everyone else wants them to be are the ones who are not getting anywhere because they don't have a competitive edge. Your passion, your grittiness, your refusal to be anyone other than yourself is what makes you a good writer if you can hone that skill to continuously improve in a way that still makes you feel like you are more and more and more yourself and more clearly able to express yourself. Honing your skill does not have to be at odds with expressing yourself in a very authentic way. Your writing should always be geared in the direction of how do I more clearly, more concisely, more impactfully communicate what I want to say from the absolute heart of myself. It should not be about how do I tone myself down to get more mass appeal. Will you have to do this sometimes for exposure? Sure. Again, that's a compromise you're sometimes going to have to make. But this should not be the heart of your work. This should not be the consistent way that you produce work. The work that you are going to build your empire of writing off of is going to be the work that is the most honest to you. Prioritize that. Hone that above everything else, and that is the single most important thing I think you will ever do in your career as an ENFP writer. I think that's all I have to say for today on this topic. If you have questions, I know I went a little bit theoretical and not too grounded in this video, so if you have anything specific you were hoping to see answered that I didn't answer, I'm totally down to do a follow-up video to this because I feel very passionate about this topic. Like I said, most of my work in my life has been in the field of writing, and I have a large amount of opinions about the field of writing, as well as about ENFPs. So I'm always happy to keep going with the topic. As always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I will see you back here again really soon.